Welcome to Playful Beginnings, a podcast about the magic of play therapy for therapists, students, and anyone interested. In our podcast, we'll explore the deeper understanding of play therapy and the skills we use when working with children.
We hope to help you understand the why behind what we do and how it helps kids heal and grow. I'm Dr. Kristie Opiola, a working play therapist and university professor in North Carolina.
I'm Dr. Maggie Parker, a play therapist and professor in DC. Good morning, Kristie.
Good morning, Maggie. How are you?
It's going to be interesting. So for our listeners, we are switching our time when we record to Monday mornings. And I realized Monday, I am a barrel of nerves and stress.
Well, maybe being together will be helpful.
I think it will be helpful. This is like my therapeutic experience for the week.
No, I know. My Mondays are typically used like prepping for everything for the week. And so I was like, oh shoot, I gotta prep early and get all this other stuff done. So it will be a switch for us, but I'm excited about it. Part of it is because our schedules get crazy each semester. We have to change things around. Listeners won't notice anything different because they still get published on the same day and the same time. But for us, just prepping for them, it'll be different.
Yes. Yeah. So we're figuring it out and it'll be great. Yeah. So today we were going to talk about ADHD or ADD. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or attention deficit disorder. I think that this has continued to be a pretty prominent diagnosis since probably the mid 90s.
Yeah.
And it's one that I think there continues to be a lot of research on. And we're thankfully, I think, delving into the nuances of what these symptoms are and what it is and how it presents. Yes. And so we're hoping to do a couple episodes where we talk about really just to help us all understand what is ADHD, how does it present according to the research, how does it align with CCPT, and helping our listeners kind of understand what it is fundamentally, what CCPT looks like, and then really probably hopefully talking to parents, because I think that's where I hear a lot of stress coming from this. That seems to be a common theme. And that's something that you should also go and get Dr. Who Line's book out. It's out and you can how to work with parents.
It's not out yet. It's coming out.
Okay.
But I was also going to say, I think although it's been around, the research is getting more and more helpful. So I really appreciate hearing as we're studying it in greater depth, we're getting to hear more about how to support children with ADHD. And boys and girls need different support. So I think it's a really important continued growth topic. The other thing is it's going to be a commonly seen intake request because I think a lot of children with ADHD or families who have children with ADHD seek support.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And we also hope that through this time, and Maggie kind of alluded to it, right? Working with parents, our hope is that we're going to give you kind of some of the undergirding to how you can talk to parents about how is CCPT helpful with ADHD, because historically the interventions have more been either behavioral or cognitive behavioral oriented. And so there is some good support in our research that CCPT is a good intervention for children with ADHD. And so we're hoping as you increase your comfort talking to parents and having a better understanding of how it's working and why it's working, that then you'll be able to communicate that to parents and other professionals to really advocate for your approach.
Absolutely. 1,000%. So, Kristie, when you think about ADD or ADHD, how do you kind of understand that diagnosis? Big question.
That is I'm like, Maggie, thanks for kicking it off a killer here. But I think what I would say is that it really is more of a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it's focuses primarily in the regulatory area is where I see kids having the biggest area of need, is that maybe their brains function differently than others, and it's not better or worse, they just function differently. And so helping to better understand how, they take in information and how they process information is a really important for me as I'm working with kids with ADHD. That's an important component is that I do want to cover and understand that. Another thing is I think it's highly misunderstood. And so oftentimes this is a population that gets told no a lot or that there's something wrong with them, that they have to change their behavior. So I think the impact of having a diagnosis of ADHD can be widespread for kids that we're seeing. The
Yeah.
other thing I know and have, I guess, learned in the last 5 or 6 years is that ADHD presents differently for boys or girls. And so it's not, I think we've always looked at it from a very male dominated model. And both Maggie and I have ADHD. And I think we were both diagnosed in adulthood, right?
Well,
Not as a kid. I wasn't diagnosed as a kid, I was diagnosed as an adult. And I think part of that reason is because it's historically been the symptomology has been looked at it from the male perspective. And as we're learning more and more about ADHD, for girls, it's, oh, yeah, how did we not catch this earlier? And I also think I had coping strategies, not healthy ones, but I think I had coping strategies that helped me manage it as a kid. And then as I've gotten older, and some things I've just learned about adult ADHD, hormone changes, different things that ADHD can really spike for females as they get older. And I think when I did find a diagnosis, when all those things were happening, and I was like, what the heck? I've
what?
always managed this so well, and now I can't seem to get my life in order. But that's what I know. What about for you, Mags?
Yeah, I think that there's so many things that you said that really resonate. And I hope for our listeners too, if we have any parents, because I'm experiencing this kind of understanding it from a clinical mental health perspective as a practitioner, as a play therapist, for myself, as someone who is diagnosed with ADHD, and then as a parent who I'm starting to be, oh, apples fall from apple trees. Okay, this makes sense. And really trying to incorporate all of the new information that's coming out. I think something that I've really resonated with and I'm recognizing that I'm doing within my own life, not in the playroom, because I think it's very different how I show up in the playroom, but what you're saying about this is something that impacts regulation and behaviors and emotional expression and organization, listening, focus, all of these things. And as a parent, what I find myself doing and what I recognize happened probably for my own self is like, no, stop. Why aren't you paying attention? Look at me. And recognizing how that's impacting me as an adult, which is that I have that real big rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So if Kristie texts me and says, hey, let's talk, I'm, well,
No.
she's breaking up with me. We're not friends anymore. She hates rape. And so that's where my head goes. And I'm starting to try and recognize how am I feeding into that within my own kids. And so it's this real tough thing. I don't think that shows up as much in the playroom because within those 45 minutes we can be really accepting and understanding. But so for the parents and the caregivers listening, I hope you kind of hear that. Maybe something to think about and clock in and recognize, because there are a lot of strengths that come with ADHD and we don't often think about those. I think we think about this as these are the things that we're not good at, as opposed to these are the things that you're really good at.
Yeah, because there's huge strengths to ADHD. I mean, there are difficulties with having ADHD, but there are some really big strengths.
And when we talked about diagnosis last week, we talked about how like sometimes what it is a way of understanding and communicating that doesn't fit within the system that we're set up for. And I think that's also very true for ADHD.
Well, and I mean, this is just a personal opinion, but I think as our education system has shifted to very cognitive focus, I think we're seeing more and more ADHD because it's not functioning well in that system.
Right.
Because there are things within the ADHD world or symptomology, they can be hyper focused on things that they're really interested themselves. May not be what the teacher is covering, or it may not be what you're wanting them to focus on as the parent or as the therapist, right? But they do have this ability to hyper focus. There's also little things like time blindness. where they can't interpret time or deadlines, or that's a really hard struggle for kiddos with ADHD and adults with ADHD. And then another thing that kind of stands out to me are, and some of the things the kids that I've worked with who have shared is they hear and feel everything. So their sense of getting overwhelmed happens. Their tolerance for all of the input that comes into them is very different than maybe someone who does not have ADHD. And so they're constantly taking in. So it's easy for them to get overwhelmed trying
Yeah.
to handle it.
Yes. And then it hits a breaking point and
Yeah.
it just kind of overflows. And it's really interesting. Even just, I saw something, I've become my mother because I'm like, y'all turn that music down so I can concentrate on driving. But part of that is if you think about a child, especially if they're more sensitive to what's happening around them, and that you're in a classroom of 28, it's gonna be pretty overwhelming.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, and I think it's so individual, right? Because I have
Mhm.
clients that need music to help them focus, and then others that any noise is super distracting to them and they can't focus, right? And then I also think some of my clients move slower. They overthink everything. And that could just be the lack of self-esteem based on external messages they've gotten a lot. And then you have others that feel like little motors that just go and go and go and go. And I'm giggling internally because I think Maggie and I are a great example of that. So my ADHD causes me to want to slow down and really make sure I'm doing things 100%. I have to really get in a hyper focus mode to do them. And one of Maggie's biggest strengths is she can just get stuff done. I love when we work together, I love it because she's really good at getting me out of that. And I think sometimes me slowing down helps her, and correct me if I'm wrong, Maggie, because she just kind of does. And I'm, wait, let's think this through. Let's make sure we're on the same page. Can we take this a step back? And, so everyone's going to look a little different. And we're great friends. We get along well. We know each other's strengths, and we also know the pieces of us that are may hiccup us when we're working together or in group work. Would you
When I
agree with that?
1,000%, I
Yeah.
am like, big picture, let's do this. And I probably waste hours trying to organize myself to make things easier. And so in the end, I end up making things much harder for me. And it's tough. And I think that what I appreciate is that I have to remind myself, and even this is getting very kind of personal, but even with recognizing my own strengths and I'm a big picture person or I'm good at this and I can get things done feels disingenuous because for so long it's but you're not organized, you're not this, you're not that. And so I hope that for our listeners talking to parents and talking to teachers and for our caregivers out there of what can you notice that they do really well and how
Yeah.
can you support them in that because they are getting messages of what they don't do well, and so how can you recognize those things, and it's hard to do.
Yeah. Well, and I was just thinking, you mentioned they have strengths. Some of those strengths are that they really can think outside the box and come up with some really creative ideas, and maybe that others don't think of, right? So they can make connections differently than maybe those of us, the people who think really linearly or whatever. So they're a great additive to a team or to a project or to a work environment, and even in the classroom.
Right.
I think they're really important to have. They're also really resilient and gritty, and they can get through things, right?
Yeah.
That sometimes because they've had to, and then they tend to be adventurous. They're
Yeah.
willing to do, they're willing to try something new,
Which is cool.
which is really cool and can be really helpful. And so I think, as Maggie's saying all this, we have to be careful not to only give messages they're not enough or there's something wrong with them and make sure that we're also highlighting the strength. And I think that is where CCPT can be really helpful.
Yeah. And before we jump into CCPT, I want to just kind of do a little bit of what some of these symptoms that you might see or that caregivers might say and how they may differ based on boys versus girls at home, at school, and with peers. And just a quick
Okay.
overview.
Sure.
I think if we're thinking about ADHD, and again, it's all unique, right? But it's all individual. And we have the DSM for a reason to try and kind of organize. So this is a general thing. I want to just be very clear. We're giving a general overview, but you might hear about caregivers saying that they are interrupting a lot, that there are a lot of tantrums, that they're not following the rules, they're not listening.
They blurt things out.
Blurt things out. It can feel power struggles a lot and digging in. And I think that sometimes it's because your brain's working really fast. Sometimes it's because you have a lot of pent up energy. Sometimes it's that hyper focus. And maybe it's also that internally they've been told what to do in all these other spaces. And so they're like, forget trying to tell me what to do. I'm going to be in charge today. Like, I don't. But a lot of these things are what parents and caregivers are going to come in for if they're experiencing these behaviors at home.
Yeah.
Because it is frustrating as a caregiver to have a child that you're constantly having to redirect and get into a power struggle with to get them to brush their teeth, right? That's frustrating. And so those might be some of the things that for girls, it's also likely that there's some low motivation. I just don't want to, or inattention, that they're focused on other things. There's also usually a lot, I think, that girls show ADHD a little bit more from what we're learning with anxiety or internalized symptoms. And they may not tell you that they're experiencing those things, but that it may show up with doing homework and just being, oh, here, it's that answer, because it might be that their anxiety is that they don't know the answer or they're not smart. And so if they don't try and they get it wrong, that feels different than if they do try and get it wrong. And so, and it might be kind of spacey or disorganized. We've talked about this so often. It's like, Mom, if you just go in my room on the third pile to the left of the bed. So it makes sense to them, but it doesn't often make sense to others. And I thought something that someone had said, and again, this is from mental health Instagram, so take with it a grain of salt, but it resonated for me, is that the hyperactivity is less about being active externally, and the hyperactivity is more about how fast your brain's working at all times.
2 times speed or 6 times speed.
My brain is constantly going.
And that is the true statement.
Yeah. Do you not think about stuff all the time? He's like,
No.
what do you do?
I think the other thing that's really important to kind of talk about is that often with ADHD, there is also a lot of masking, and we don't talk about that enough. That people are working really hard to appear normal or like they've got it together. Um, and that can be really a challenge because that's not exhibited outwardly. That is what's happening internal in their system. And for boys who tend to be more externalizing, where we see it more, we can see the problem. The scary thing is for girls, they're kind of suffering in silence. And so to be mindful of that. And there is some societal expectation of some of those characteristics for girls too. So we kind of normalize it, though they could be really struggling.
Right. Yeah, 1,000%.
And then the other thing I said earlier, hormones play a big role. And we see this both in boys and girls, though I think in females, what happens is we cycle more than boys do hormonally, especially once they hit puberty. And so it also can have some pretty big impacts, both with how it's showing up and the intensity of symptoms. We can see a difference as there's switches hormonally. And I have had some kiddos that I've worked with that their depression or anxiety or self-harm symptoms get much worse. And it's only around the time of hormonal changes. And it's almost becomes a predictable pattern, which can be really helpful for parents, but it's also very scary because it comes frequently, right? And making sure that things are getting treated well on both sides, both hormonally and with the ADHD.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I also think, when we're thinking about what this looks like at school, and I'm a school counseling faculty, and really working with my school counselors and my school counseling students, also look out for the quiet kids or the kids that are withdrawn, or every child you need to be able to check in with, which is really hard when we have so many children in elementary school. But because there is some masking and it's not always, whereas in the school system, a lot of times boys are going to be more frequently referred to because of behavioral problems that they may and disciplinary responses. And so they may get diagnosis earlier and services earlier and more often than the girls who may not show up in that way. I also think it's really interesting. We did a research study on this too, is that, you know, their behaviors, whatever they may be, often, if there's externalizing behaviors within the classroom, they're going to be often excluded from the classroom or sent outside of the classroom, and it can go to the principal or discipline. And really, a lot of this needs to be, this is a mental health kind of experience as well. And so, how can we get them pulled into the school counselor to get those supports? For girls, it's going to be a little different. It might be inattentive. And
Yep.
excuse me,
I said forgetfulness. I think sometimes that gets missed.
daydreaming. They may
Mhm.
be considered shy or unmotivated, but they're not, it's not disruptive, right? I would just be in my head in school. I mean, even now in meetings, if I don't take notes, I am off in my own world. And online meetings make it really terrible because I can look up all sorts of other things at the same time and not have to be paying attention. And that is
Wow.
often a sign of what's happening with girls. And then all of a sudden, if they have to take a test or they have to do something and they've been off in their own world. And so it's going to impact in different ways. And often those experiences are sometimes, according to my research, those children are sent more to special education, which there is a space for them in that to learn those things. But again, it's also something that can be part of the school counselor and mental health supports.
Yeah. No, I think those are good points.
And then just a couple more things, like with friends and peers, you might experience more aggression or impulsive acts or rule breaking with boys, whereas girls may be more relational. So exclusion, difficulty with friendships. Girls,
Misreading. So, like what Maggie talked about earlier, of misreading or miscuing can happen here too. And it doesn't mean they're part of ASD, right? It really is that they may be hypersensitive to social interactions and how they're perceiving or picking up, or that strong people pleasing component can play a big role.
yeah, I keep saying 1,000%. I need to edit all that out.
1,000%.
Uh, but I think it's also just, yeah. So understanding that there also could be some differential diagnosis to think about as you're exploring. So it could be that girls, a differential diagnosis might be anxiety or depression, and they may be overlooked with some of these ADHD characteristics because they are more internalized. So just taking that into consideration as a mental health therapist when diagnosing. And I
And
noticed,
I found a quote that I thought was really interesting. This came
okay,
from CDC, that 78% of children with ADHD have a comorbid diagnosis. So typically it's not just ADHD.
yeah. I mean, it just impacts a lot. And I
And
don't
a
think
lot
it's,
of them tend to be conduct or behavioral related.
that was like one of the hardest things when ODD and conduct disorder are really big diagnoses that I really stay away from. I have a hard time as a just my fundamental belief system in those. And so often it's you mix ADHD as is, and then maybe, which is a neurological thing, or trauma, which also has neurological impacts. And I notice with boys, that's where the ODD and CD comes in. And so really kind of thinking about and taking a pause, is it that they're oppositional defiant, or is it that their brain is engaging in a different way and they're trying to communicate something with us that we're not understanding? And I think that's really, really important. And thinking about these things, you're likely going to be talking with teachers and caregivers in your intake and as you're kind of going along. And so picking up on some of these cues and behaviors, I hope this is what we want you to do, or how we hope this is helpful for y'all. And also recognizing the gender differences so that you can provide that information, that if you're not the one that's doing the assessments, that if you are referring people for these types of assessments, that they're going to look at gender differences and how this might influence, and being aware of that, and talking with teachers and caregivers and providing that psychoeducation of how it might show up, how it won't. Talking with the school counselor, hey, listen, I understand that my daughter is not being disruptive in class, but is she daydreaming? Have you observed what this looks like
She's
during
not disrupting others, but she's disrupting herself.
herself? And so really helping kind of think about what that looks like. And then in the event that you're going into IEP or 504 meetings, I think that information can really help you as you think about what supports might be available within a school setting, because they may be getting CCPT with you outside, or if you're a CCPT within the school, as a school counselor, but they may need other things. And so knowing kind of how this shows up, I think is really helpful. Anything else that I miss on that?
No, but I do want to say what is going to come at you from parents and teachers are the behavioral things, right? And from a CCPT stance, that's not probably the direction we're going to hyper focus on therapeutically.
Mm-hmm.
And so as Maggie was sharing, or even just the labeling and the diagnosing, I was like, oh, I never connect these things together because I don't think that way.
Right.
But others are thinking that way. Schools are thinking that way. Psychiatrists are thinking that way. Assessment teams are thinking that way. So we do need to be mindful of all of those pieces. We can't be ostriches and put our head in the sand and say, nah, I don't need to know this because we don't use labels within play therapy. And so I do want to, or within child-centered play therapy, because I do think it's important that we really have good understanding of maybe the how others are perceiving these kids. And we do need to understand them because I've had parents who say, we think she has ADHD and she doesn't have ADHD, right? Or he doesn't have ADHD. I think it's something else. But really getting a better understanding of where they're coming from is going to be a really important quality so that if you're the first one to diagnose them, right, for HMO or for because the parents are asking, at least you have a good understanding of the diagnostic criteria.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Kristie. I think this is a really good overview.
Yes, I think so too. We hope it's helpful. If we forgot something, let us know because we are not, I do want to put this out there. We are not ADHD experts,
No.
right? It's something that we see. We did research to make sure we could talk about it, but there may be things that we missed. And so please let us know. Share in the comments below. Feel free to email us at playtherapyspace or info@playtherapyspace.com. You can email us individually too. So Maggie@playtherapyspace.com or Kristie@playtherapyspace.com. It's helpful.
Yeah.
We may have missed something. And if you are an expert, we are going to have an expert on that this is their passion area and their area of interest. And so stay tuned.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Kristie. Make sure to like and subscribe.
Have a great day, guys.